Great. Well, it's nice to meet everybody. I'm Laura Frericks. I'm the Executive Director of the University of Illinois Research Park and Enterprise Works Incubator. At the University of Illinois, we are one of the largest engineering schools, and we are a place where there's a lot of innovation happening across campus. The Research Park has 120 companies and is located in Champaign-Urbana with a mix of startup companies and corporate innovation centers.
Stephen.
Good afternoon or morning or wherever you are in this world right now. I'm Stephen Colston. I'm a principal architect and urban designer with Perkins & Will. Lead a lot of our work in the Innovation District and Research Park planning and design sector.
All right, Jessica.
Hello, Jessica Figgenholtz. I'm the Higher Education Practice Leader and Associate Principal for Perkins & Will. I work with campuses and institutions across the Midwest with Laura and Greg. Thank you.
Wonderful. And Greg.
Hey, good afternoon. Greg Deason. I'm with Purdue University and also the Purdue Research Foundation. We have research parks throughout the state of Indiana, as well as an innovation district called Discovery Park District. It's a good pleasure to be with you today.
Welcome, everybody, to this first breakout session of the AURP 2020 International Conference. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 will have a lasting impact on us all. On this, we can surely all agree. Our communities of innovation are the place where change is constant. Paradigms are ever evolving and new trends are inevitable. There is no place better positioned than to respond to this disruption than research parks and innovation districts. I'm glad you're here with us today for this discussion with an experienced group of research park and design professionals to explore the pandemic impact, near-term responses, and long-term strategies to ensure our innovation ecosystems flourish. Joining us today are Stephen Coulson, who is principal at Perkins & Will, Jessica Figgenholtz, associate principal at Perkins & Will, Greg Deason, senior vice president of entrepreneurship and placemaking at Purdue Research Foundation, and Laura Frericks, Executive Director of the University of Illinois Research Park. I'm going to now turn it over to our panelists.
Great, thank you, Leah. As we prepared for today's conversation, we thought that one of the best ways to frame this was to break it into three parts. What have we learned as a collective being from March with the pandemic, both professionally and I'm sure some personal anecdotes? Where are we today as research parks and campuses, and what's ahead? And not that we have a crystal ball to predict what we might see, but just to see where the trends are going and how we might be able to adapt and flex to those needs. So we'll start off with what have we learned and really understanding the phases of a pandemic. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the World Health Organization's mapping of the pandemic phase. And right now we are in this transition phase where we thought we were going a little bit more to the future prep, but for those of you in the Midwest, or I'm from the Chicago studio, Perkins & Will, we are going back down into a lockdown. And so these lines are really a transition and ebb and flow. And it's understanding, where you are now and how best to move forward and be prepared, as you never know when there might be this shift. Excuse me. And as I think through our place on campuses and universities across the country, and also within research parks, it's not just about when you're within the facility yourself, but what is that journey from when you leave your personal place of residence? How do you commute, knowing that in urban settings, many folks are concerned about mass transit? How do you access the building? How do you get in? How do you convey yourself throughout the building? And really, what are those protocols and safety of that journey of getting to your desk? And what are these impacts in every aspect of our life, not just in the workplace, but also learning environments? And this is a recent snapshot of just how we've all flexed and adapted to our new norm, for lack of a better word. And what are the impacts to research and development, manufacturing? There has been some slowdown and minimal operations, especially in the healthcare world, but in other aspects, in ag, Laura shared a story that actually continued because much of the work was conducted outside in the fresh air, and it was dependent on the cycles of the growing season. So it's really understanding the holistic impact of the pandemic to our lives, both professionally and personally, and our workflow. So the first question that I have for Greg and for Laura and Stephen is really, what have we learned? What have we learned from March that really sets a foundation of how to move forward in a positive way? So Laura, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you, Jessica, for leading the discussion. As you've said, we've learned to be more flexible. It isn't necessarily just that we're going to prepare our workforce to respond to COVID, and then we're going to go on our way and it's going to continue in that pathway. We've gone back and forth. We've also learned to be much more resilient. So our ability to work with our entrepreneurs and work with our corporate sites to keep them viable throughout all these changes that are occurring. So that meant keeping our incubator open because those R&D companies still needed to access laboratory suites. It meant supporting our ag tech clients, as I said, out in the field. And it meant creating more cohesive communities of the companies to support each other, even if it's in an online environment. We also have been working to try to keep our people safe, and that includes a mix of a testing regimen on campus, as well as redesigning some of our office spaces to be more spaced, safe, and much cleaner in terms of all the ways that we're being able to respond. And lastly, some of the things is I think creative use of outdoor space has been really important, as that is one of the best ways that we've been able to move the workforce outside and be able to persevere.
Great, thank you. Greg, can you share some thoughts of how Purdue Research Park has learned from where we were in March to today?
I think I'll just build off of some of the things that Laura shared. I mean, one of the things that's been interesting is just that that this is not affecting all areas equally. IT jobs are a lot more easily accomplished from remote, whereas our ag tech jobs continue to thrive. Our lab facilities continue to thrive. Our manufacturing facilities continue to thrive. And I think that gives us some notion about what the future might be. Does that affect the way we think about the kinds of companies that we know are physically place dependent? Of course, we're all dealing with the challenges that go with not being able to network in the same ways, to gather in the same ways, to interact, to even use facilities like the ones that we have that were deliberately created to create those serendipitous collisions throughout the day. We've had to come up with different ways to get that done. But I think, it's an old adage, especially in the startup world, which I spend a lot of time in, about how necessity, is the mother of all invention. And I think even though we had many of the tools that we're using right now, I don't know that we fully appreciated how level the playing field got. Laura and I are both right in the heartland of America. And as we heard in the earlier session about the distribution of venture capital to mostly the coast and just really a couple of cities. I mean, we're finding that a company can be as interactive with us as they might have once been down the hall. They can be on the other side of the globe. And so I think as we go forward, we've had some eye-opening experiences as well that have led to even more inclusion, more robust communities, albeit they're virtual.
Thanks, Greg. Stephen, thoughts? Stephen, we can't hear you.
Sorry, thank you. I think it's interesting how everyone's adapted. And I think we'd be very interested. We realized during our preparation that we had taken a swatch kind of from the middle of the U.S. with Jessica and I being in Chicago and Austin respectively, and Greg and Laura in at Purdue in Illinois. So it'd be great to hear some people from the East and West Coast, but I was speaking another swatch from that kind of central area. I was talking with Stephen Frazier with the Texas State University Science and Technology Research Park. And he was saying, in March that they had lost like 40% of their employment base, but they had gone from a vacancy to 2% to about 30%. But the remarkable thing, and I think it just speaks to the resilience of our innovation communities, that within 60 days, they were back up to a 0% vacancy rates. So, as we're seeing venture capital make a comeback in other places, there's one thing that we found out about our science and research spaces is the equipment, that very, very expensive piece of equipment, is still sitting on the lab bench. Those fume hoods only exist in that particular room with those number of airflows that are, making that space somewhat safer in many cases. And the mice still need to get fed. So there's a stickiness factor that I think has required a lot of our technical research and laboratory spaces to require folks to physically come together. I think the idea of having those spaces that have also facilitated people coming back have required folks within the research environments to be in constant communication with the participants there. Giving regular nudges to what the rules of behavior are and kind of friendly reminding people, but also providing lots of positive reinforcement for all the good that people are doing in terms of behaving in proper ways. I think it's interesting the way things are varying from place to place. I know some folks are actually saying we're not going to get into the business of what happens in the labs of the tenants in our research park buildings because it gets into some liability issues. But when we come back to the common areas of the buildings, we're going to be very deliberate in those approaches. And so a lot of responsibility being taken by a lot of the participants in this process.
Thanks. So where are we today? I think that the comments you heard from Stephen, Laura, and Greg are really starting to set the foundation of we're not out of the pandemic. And I think that there's going to be a lot that is going to continue forward, but there are some good things that I think that we can also take away from that. So it will be great to hear maybe, what's been working and what might move forward post-pandemic. But where we are today, and I do think it's fantastic that we have this before election day. So there are so many stressors on us right now, not only a global health pandemic, but there is a climate crisis affecting all of us deeply. There is racial injustices and social inequities. There is political concerns in the next 24 to 48 hours. And how does that resolve? I mean, for goodness sake, there was a toilet paper shortage. So, everything is affecting us not only professionally and personally, as I mentioned, but it's really also causing a lot of stressors on us that we've never imagined before. And what does that mean not only to our sense of place, but also to our physical spaces, and how are we supporting individuals when they do re-enter the research parks and the across campuses. This is a little bit outdated now, as this was a snapshot from the Johns Hopkins coronavirus map that they are actively tracking the numbers that have affected our country and across the globe. And from recent events this past weekend, Europe is starting to shut down again. Curfews are being enacted. So this really is something that is not going to be going away. And how do we adjust and pivot accordingly? And what's interesting, and what Stephen commented earlier, is that we are in that center slot of the country, and wherever you are on this map, your perception and the way that the pandemic has affected you and how you work and your workflow, it varies dramatically. And it's really about how are we being nimble and agile and making sure that we are connecting with people virtually and still communicating and still trying to build that culture across all sorts of platforms. And as some offices are reopening, it also is the culture of, are your employees ready? Because everybody has a different set of circumstances within their own home front? Do they even have the ability to return with childcare being affected or taking care of elderly parents, or are autoimmune compromised themselves? I'm sure several of you on this call right now probably have children that are virtual learning, as I do, in the room next door. So we're all working through a set of circumstances that are unique, never been seen before, but making sure that that communication and culture is really a positive, and often is where you're going to start breaking down those silos and connecting with people in a way that may have not happened before. And that's an example of what I hope will continue to shine through post-pandemic, and a lesson learned. And on the R&D manufacturing front, acceleration of some of these trends have already begun, where there's automation of certain efficiencies of products, because robots and AI have already stepped in to take a place of maybe some work that had been not as efficient before. So pausing there of really, where are we today on our research parks and innovation squares on campuses across the country, and where are we seeing kind of where what that landscape looks like for us in our ecosystem? So Greg, do you want to start us off?
Sure, happy to. And I think it's hard to talk about where we are today without some view to the future. But as I mentioned, in terms of sort of the space dependency question, we've spent a lot of time evaluating all of our space to try to determine, are there opportunities now for us to begin to shift some of that to those that are more dependent on physical space. Lab space is a part of that, but certainly assembly and manufacturing and other aspects of that are part of it. So that's a very significant aspect of what we're doing. I would also say that we're definitely leaning into virtual. It's interesting, before the pandemic, just to handle the volume of some of our programs, we had gone to some virtual testing and had found that we could make that work. We didn't know we were going to have to make it work quite the way we did now, but we're already finding that one of the events I used to host live that had 50 people per week has averaged close to 1,500 participants, albeit it's consumed more like a podcast than it was a live event. But that's an example of something where I think if you had asked me in past times, would I rather have 1,500 people being reached virtually or 50 live? I know the answer would have been the former. So those are aspects of what we're doing. But I think the other aspects of that we're playing into is many of the tools that we have been taken away because of the physical realm, but there are many things we still can do. And of course, this has caused us to look at a great many more outdoor activities, albeit a bit worried that the wintertime is coming and that's gonna take some of those away in the future. But we got more creative on outdoor activities, kayak trips. We did more walks in the park. We did more virtual or more in-person gatherings where we could maintain social distancing outdoors. And I think that actually stretched us into some different areas that we might not have gone into. You also mentioned just the stress on mental health. This is really more of an operational comment, but in some ways we're closer to our teams today than we've ever been. We check in almost every day. We're trying to make sure that they have services available to make sure that they are able to stay mentally healthy, because this does add stress, whether you're educating children from home, taking care of elderly parents, or just suffering from isolation. We know that extends into our workforce as well. So we've been mindful to try to provide a great many links and insights into how we're managing our company at Purdue, so that they might adapt those into their companies and the businesses that they're running as well.
Great, thank you, Greg. Laura, do you want to add?
Yeah, there's two areas I thought I'd jump on to what Greg was getting at as well, specifically for our corporate innovation centers. Similarly, that Greg talked about getting to know your employees, our companies are getting to know each other in new ways too. The fact that they're part of our research park created that cohesion, different than all the other companies that interact with the university. There was a shared collected sense of being still a community with one another. They had previously met in person many times, and even new people that have been hired during the pandemic being connected with this group. And you're seeing their dogs, you're seeing their kids, and companies being able to see whether it's a competitive company or another completely different industry, that they can learn from one another. And so now we're meeting just much more regularly. before, these were events that had to have a lot more planning, and now there's Zoom meetings that can happen on a pop-up. We're inviting university leaders and faculty to join with our companies, and we're having companies share best practices, making them sort of the star of the show of talking about their best ways of doing recruitment, or how they do KPIs, or how they're approaching cloud computing or 5G technologies. Another is the aspect of students working at a university campus. I'd mentioned we have a lot of testing. In fact, students are getting tested at least 2 times a week. So 10,000 tests a day at the university, more than any other university, I believe, in the US, about 2% of all the US testing. What has that allowed? Well, it means for those that are continuing operations on site, that they're able to determine whether the students have had a very recent same day result of their COVID tests. And that has allowed some corporations to be comfortable with them returning to the office. And what's different about students is, first of all, they're incredibly happy to come into work now, because so much of their life is virtual. If they can have the experience in a safe way of being able to contribute and see each other as teams, it's been really well received. They're very respectful of wearing masks and distancing. And lastly, they have something that we don't have the same conditions of, Jessica. They don't have their kids at home that they're looking to have to watch over or do remote learning for. They're available, and their class schedules are more flexible than ever before, with many more of the lectures happening online as a hybrid kind of flow. That makes working while they're in school more possible, something we've been able to leverage at the Research Park.
And I think Laura and Greg, you both brought up great points, is that with the virtual platform, you're actually being more accessible to your campus community. Before, if you had a meeting that was an hour long, people would have to, travel across campus. That would take 15 minutes, and an hour meeting now just turned into almost a 2-hour meeting with transit or whatever. And with the virtual platform, you're able to extend the offer, the invite, to larger group of people, and really bringing that sense of community together. I think that's fantastic. And again, hopefully something that will continue on post pandemic in some kind of capacity. So Stephen, thoughts?
Well, I think for those of you who know me very much know that I spend a lot of time, or used to spend a lot of time, on an airplane coming to your communities and working in different places across the country. And I haven't done that since March, and I think maybe right before our spring training trip and a trip to San Francisco for our University of Utah work. That was a really kind of insightful perspective as we kind of look back over the last 8 months and kind of see where we are today. And I think we've been in a mode of adaptation. And I think right now, especially as we move into this as we move into this cold winter, we're moving into a real time of innovation. We've been at this point of this tipping point of expectations of things to get back to normal, whatever that might look like in the future. I think none of us really can know, but we're starting to feel the stresses of some of our engagements and working within the limitations of the tools that we have. And some of those have to deal with strategies to be very equitable in terms of making sure that we have people involved in a lot of what we do, or planning these innovation communities, is making sure all the voices are at the table and that we're having the opportunities to be heard. But we're also now discovering some of the shortcomings of our technological platforms. And we're right in a really interesting point of innovation, of starting to use tools differently, use and kind of reinvent and remodel some of our innovation tools. And I think that's going to be a really crucial aspect as we move forward and think about kind of this hybrid world that we're going to be living in as we move forward.
Thank you, Stephen. So what's ahead? I know I mentioned none of us have crystal balls to really predict what's going to happen. But really, I'd like to start thinking through, what has worked and that will prepare us for the next round. I think, we're hearing from scientists that there will be future pandemics or future health concerns that affect the global landscape. And how are we better prepared now that what we've learned from March and really guides us to be resilient as research parks and campuses? So I threw this in here, and I'm stealing the word from Stephen, bumpability. It's the intentional design of spaces and places to promote accidental interaction. And Greg mentioned that earlier, is that really being cognizant of these spaces in our research parks where those serendipitous conversations occur, or you're connecting with people that you may not normally see on a regular basis. And within this world of a pandemic where we're social distancing and needed to be 6 feet apart, how are we using our real estate, really thinking through what that new normal or mixed mode might be? This is an example that CBS aired a couple of weeks ago of how China is starting to embrace the technology and the platforms, various platforms, to have individuals engage in their various bubbles, and whether those bubbles are in person and how they're connecting with other folks that were part of their class or their teams, and then how our faculty and leaders adapting and embracing that as well. When we were preparing for this presentation, Laura had shared this article, I think what actually had just come out about a week ago, about how with the rise of remote working, many startups are thinking through their existing real estate investments and how that might change and how that might pivot to certain urban centers that are more economical, more efficient, and provide maybe a better quality of life. And so I think one example that was in there was a certain tech company started in Los Angeles was looking at Tempe, Arizona, because they were able to get more bang for their buck, but also provide a lifestyle for their workforce that was more suitable to today's world and into today's environment. And so, we are seeing this emergence of with remote working, not necessarily needing to be in that same place where the companies that you're representing or the campuses that you work on. And there was also another article in Wall Street recently that the biotech properties is an area where lots of investors and developers are doubling down on the real estate because they see this this growth and this resurgence in medical research and inventory. And really, how does that start to define our research parks and campuses with adjacencies of research needs of what's existing and what's in the future? So knowing that you guys know exactly what's going to happen in the next, couple years, if you can talk a little bit about what you see as trends emerging and how does that really affect your place both at Purdue, Illinois, and Stephen, you can kick us off even in the Austin area, where we might be pivoting to and flexing towards in the future.
Well, I think as we think about Austin, we think about other great innovation communities around the country. This whole thing that you tapped in about going mixed mode is going to be really, really crucial. But one of the last things you mentioned, that Wall Street Journal article, is that I think is kind of fascinating is this whole notion is that capital is really becoming available. I was talking with some folks from Urban Land Institute last week, and they were saying how there is just money that's sitting around waiting to get spent. And one of the places right now that seems like the safe spot, and one of Jessica, one of our colleagues was saying he was getting calls from developers every week, but now is getting every 2 weeks calls from investors who are saying, how do I invest in this science area? And I think for us, in terms of our university research parks, our innovation communities, there's a positive and maybe a sign of warning to be considered around that. The good news is we may see major opportunities for influx of monies to fund some of our public-private partnerships and our collaborations in there, and as we move forward. The sort of warning signal might be for us is that we may see some less sophisticated players coming into the market, when we know that we have very sophisticated building types in many of our innovation communities. The other thing that may be important for us to be aware of is just protecting our flank, being concerned about what might be happening out there around our edges and creating a potential for one of those housing bust kind of situations where we oversaturate the market. So I think that's a true issue of consideration to move as we move forward. The The other thing I was kind of thinking about is that, you know, a lot of our communities that we're working with and some of the research and innovation districts, research parks and innovation districts that I've been talking with over the last couple of months, and in fact, even several of the tech parks and research parks we're working on are still moving forward with great optimism around creating these spaces and places of bumpability. And I think it has a lot to do with the fact that we are very social creatures as human. And so we're craving those opportunities for interaction. And so how we go about designing those and framing those so that they're inclusive and yet safe to be able to accommodate those meaningful levels of interaction is going to be really crucial. So again, I think we're at a real tipping point of moving from adaptation into innovation, and I'm super excited to see what's ahead.
Great. Greg, do you have additional thoughts? And I'd also pose to you and Laura thinking through if the pandemic has affected also how you lease your spaces and how that might shift over the next couple of years. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think hybrid is a word that we're going to use a lot, whether we're talking about hybrid events, hybrid schedules, hybrid work environments. I think that is a word we're going to use a lot of in the future. And when I think about that, there are pressures it puts on space. For example, you know, the space that we have where it's assigned to one person all the time could be adaptively reused. But if we're in this mode where maybe for the next several years, if not indefinitely, even if we return to work, I think we'll see a scenario where we're not in every day like we used to be. I think it will be different. We've learned some new things about this. As Stephen said, he probably is not going to jump on an airplane every single time to go to a meeting. He's going to use other tools. I think we'll do that too. With that in mind, though, when we have our teams together, I think we're going to want them all to be there so we can take full advantage. And so how you handle that peak is going to be something that's interesting. And I believe that if that's something that we're thinking about within our own teams, it's the same kind of thing that our companies are thinking about as well. I think in the other aspect of a hybrid schedule, thinking then about hybrid events, you know, this business of learning that we can have 1,500 virtual attendees versus 50 live, I think in the future we'll try to mix both the live and the pre-recorded feeds and make it into something that has something for everyone. Those that want to tune in from across the globe can. Those that can come physically and be part of an actual physical networking can be part of that as well. So I see some good things coming from that. In terms of leasing so far, I think probably the biggest thing is that we know that some of our less physically dependent areas like manufacturing and other things where it is space dependent, take an IT company, I think we are watching that closely. So far, we've not seen the erosion of that, but that is a possibility. With that in mind, I think one of the things we've spent a ton of time working on and even campaigning towards is how do we use this opportunity to engage our alumni that might be on one of the coasts, not only to be more easily engaged with startup companies or existing business, but to also think about migrating back to a place where they had a great experience as an undergrad or a graduate student, a place that's got a lot to offer them. And we're working very hard on how we might message that properly going forward. I think at a very personal level, one of the other things, and I mentioned kind of the mental well-being of people as the days get shorter right now, even the ability to have hybrid daily schedules is going to be part of what people are doing. Got a lot of people right now that are saying, would you mind if I work from 7:30 to 11 and then again from 2 until 7 so that I can take advantage of the midday to work out, take a walk and other things when there's sunlight and opportunities. I think all of that, if those are happening in our individual teams, are going to be things we need to be ready to accommodate amongst the companies that work with us as well.
Great point, Greg. And it goes back to the comment about the culture and that sense of connection and communication. You know, as long as everyone embraces that and there's that collective collaboration wanting to do that, I think that's fantastic. And we're going to be seeing that, I think, in a lot of aspects of our work. Laura, got your crystal ball shaking?
Yeah, some things that Greg was talking about too, of just this hybrid nature of flexibility. I think it's sometimes office space for people. They do want to go in sometimes. Sometimes you don't want the distraction of your children and you've got an important meeting or you're recording for a session like this, perhaps. Sometimes you want to print things because you're working on accounting details and actually it matters to look at spreadsheets in the paper context and you might not want to do that at your home. Sometimes actually interacting with your fellow peers is a healthy mental well-being thing, as Greg was just saying. So I think it's a sometimes, and that makes us think about our workstations differently, less about our big office that we perhaps had before. I don't think if people are wanting to have meetings in their individual offices, but they are wanting meeting spaces where they can stretch out with the team and distance and be able to have the electronics in the space. We also will probably have more outdoor meeting areas. This was something that was in a Perkins and Will session back in spring training at AURP, as I'd mentioned, that luckily I listened and paid attention to and added some outdoor meeting space early. And another thing is just embracing the park. So many of us as research parks have kind of a park-like atmosphere. And Greg mentioned the walk around. So the walking meeting outside is something that Yahoo Verizon does in our research park. And I see our teams taking meetings outside in ways that I think is good for them in the middle of the day when we have those daylight hours, and something that we might be more intentional about of how we plan meetings and spaces as well. So use the park-like atmosphere. And part of that plays into, I think, corporate real estate strategy. We're hearing a lot of big companies say things like hub and spoke. So the hub and spoke might be the downtown office and suburban locations, but I hope it also includes a mix of the university communities that can be some of those spokes that get you closer to the tech talent that you need for your future, that get you to a younger workforce that might be part of the solution, and also to creative ideas from our campuses. Our campuses are incredibly resilient. R&D is still happening at US universities, and it's being funded by a lot of science that needs to happen in our campus. So we think there'll be more startups coming out of that scientific pursuits that are happening on campus. And because those labs are still open, we're still open for business at the university. And we hope industry will enjoy continuing to interact with us, our students, our faculty, our researchers.
Great. Thank you. Well, I will turn it over to Leah. I know that there might be some questions from the audience, so I would say either submit them via chat or unmute and ask yourself, and I'll turn it over to Leah to facilitate. And I'll stop sharing my screen, Leah. Does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for your presentation and your flexibility. I love that. Yeah, so I have a couple of questions that have been submitted to me. And feel free, you know, anybody to, these weren't directed to any one of our panelists today. In addition to the changes that we see in how we work, I wonder if you are seeing any new companies created that are unique to the pandemic. Are you seeing this in any of your parks? One of our attendees asks this.
There are certainly some responding to the medical needs of the pandemic. So whether that is development of new diagnostics, researchers seeing opportunities to play in that space. We have a student startup that was even creating new ways to open doors using some of 3D printed technology of things that they added to the doors in the incubator. We have a robotics company that started working on UV sanitization in hospitals. So they aren't all brand new, but many of them pivoting and being opportunistic of where the funding is right now and where the opportunity to meet the market. I'm sure, Greg, you're seeing some startups as well on campus.
Yeah, we certainly are. I mean, certainly those that are working in sanitation and vaccine areas, there's been a bit of a bump there. But I think something that's maybe a little bit just more of an adaptive reuse. You know, there are companies that have got some capability that could be shifted to do PPE creation and so forth. And we're seeing that happen as well. So, you know, I think if I were to look into the crystal ball, though, you know, there's no doubt, and it's probably not even profound, but those companies that can create unique user experiences, especially in the virtual world, are going to win out over some that are not. And so we do have companies in the, that are emerging out of EE or other areas that can interpret video feeds and so forth, that I think are getting some new life as well, where before they thought they might be playing in marketing space or other things, now are realizing that some of what they know how to do, even to analyze someone in an interview. I mean, all of our job fairs have gone to these virtual waiting room technologies, and having a son that's a junior right now at Purdue, gotten a chance to hear firsthand how that's worked. But interesting choices. Would you rather be 6 feet apart with masks on, or virtual so you can see a person's face? But there's a lot of artificial intelligence emerging around how do we actually even interpret better what we're seeing there. So things in that realm, I think, are going to continue to grow. And thank goodness, especially for those of us in the heartland, ag tech is thriving right now. We're going to continue to need to feed our people. If anything, we may need to feed even more because of the post-pandemic boom that we're about to have. So,
And
I think there's also, we're seeing a lot of our universities, especially some of our big public states, that are becoming the heart of a lot of the transition and the health and COVID related response. I think we're seeing a lot of that at the University of Utah Research Park. I was also talking with Rebecca Conwell, at the president of University of New Orleans Research and Technology Park, and she was saying how one of their companies there is one of those companies that is, and I guess this actually ties back to what we were talking about earlier about a lot of things that were already happening being accelerated during COVID, whether it's issues of robotics and automation or other things. But some of those economies that were really industries that were really able to quickly pivot to be responsive to the market. And one of their companies in their park is one that actually does the screening of your biometrics and your temperature that can be used at a building level. So if anybody's been up to one of those at an elevator that have been set up. So if you can imagine something like that getting accelerated into practical application, where you start thinking about how spaces and places and buildings are actually designed in different ways in the future. And we're starting to see the advent of things like Zoom rooms, right? And people are very, deliberately thinking about accommodating spaces like those.
Leah, I was just going to a talent session for AURP just about a week ago, and there was discussion from NACE, the Collegiate Recruiting Organization, about that jobs are not flat right now. So certain sectors are really in growth mode and others are decreasing, but understanding from a company engagement standpoint, as Greg said about ag tech doing well, but there's also businesses, CPG, distribution, logistics, some of the medical companies that are thriving. So just understanding and being responsive to which industries are good drivers for economic development right now and which ones might be suffering.
Absolutely. Folks, I had another question submitted to me, and someone is wondering about if you can speak, and maybe this is a little bit more on the architectural side, if you can speak to projects that you are doing right now that are repurposing office spaces into lab space, how you're doing that, if you're creating temporary lab spaces, or if you're just wholesale, refitting space. But I can tell that there's some interest in that.
I can kick off at least one comment. We've got a new facility, what we call our Discovery Park District, which is a true innovation district adjacent to campus. One of the lead buildings in that is a building called Convergence. It's a 150,000 square foot building. It's a large building. I'm in that building most of the days that I am in. But that building was really almost always conceived to be an office environment. I would tell you that we've already got LOIs out on converting two of the floors of that building to exclusively to lab space, to make sure that we can do that. We had always thought of the theoretical possibility, but now it's become something that we're actually leaning into and marketing specifically to that, thinking that that would be more resilient and more likely in this environment.
Thanks, Greg.
I can add a quick comment about maybe the office space. We are seeing this in a couple of different institutions, but even specifically in our own office in Chicago is, to Laura's point, people don't want to meet in their office because you're not going to be able to get the appropriate social distancing, but how can those spaces be converted for spaces of need? And we're turning those offices into actual Zoom rooms. So if you have a presentation or a recording, our IT folks have come in and set up the Zoom rings with computers, the appropriate light, and even some help with the acoustics, so that if you are having an interview or a presentation, there's these spots that are dedicated for that. So that's one example. But then another example is also creating those social spaces, but having seating already pre-populated, if you will, in safe distances, so that conference rooms and tables, pulling those chairs out just so that people can still feel that they can utilize it, but it's in a safe manner. And I think that's ultimately one of the biggest things we're hearing, is just making sure that every decision that is made and every change that's made is for the safety of the occupants.
It sounds like there was a kind of a specific architectural connotation to that. And I don't want to completely misconstrue the representation of the question, but I think to take traditional kind of office building environments and convert them over to sophisticated wet lab kinds of environments that may, require things like negative air pressure and, fume hoods and cabinets and the like are maybe a little bit more challenging, and are a bit more challenging even in kind of a non-COVID situation. But what we're constantly having to remind sort of non-innovation research community science related stakeholders that we work with is not all research that happens at a bench is always wet. And there is extraordinary amounts of research that are happening that could almost be happening in an office environment, but for the activity that it's deemed as, quote unquote research. And some of the work we're working with right now, we're working with the Medical Centers of America in El Paso, and one of their anchor institutions is really kind of building their Center for Community Health Impacts. And so it's a major funded research space, but it need be no more sophisticated than maybe having really decent number of airflows in the space for the machines that they're bringing people in and actually testing them on, from a cardiovascular perspective. But everything else is very kind of, off the bench kind of technology related stuff. It may be the equipment that's sitting on the table or in the lab space, but doesn't require as much technology sophistication. So it does allow for some of that adaptation. Now, all of that said, I think we do predict some disruption in the marketplace. I was talking with another client the other day who was saying that they've come across one of these technology firms that's based up in Chicago who said, we're realizing that we all moved into a work from home mode, and we're basically just going to dissolve all of our real estate portfolio and give up all of our leases and, re-put that back into funding new innovation activities or into the pockets of our employees. So I think there's some shifts that relate exactly to what Laura was saying a minute ago, is the market is not going to be even as we move forward here. We're going to see spikes, deviations, pivots, and major changes. So this whole notion of moving out of this sort of adapted mode into a real place of innovation and unprecedented expectations, I think is going to be really crucial.
Stephen, if I could build off of that for just a moment, there's no way to predict this precisely, but the thought that if I just have an office building that may be nice and in a nice location, it may or may not have a particular X factor. I am certainly hopeful and rooting for our research parks, our innovation districts, the X factors that make them unique, the talent that is available, the core competencies of their university are the reason that they come and thrive in those locations. So too early to tell, but my hope is that many of the things that drew someone to be in our environment cannot be replicated purely in a remote mode. And I will definitely offer up a prayer that is true going forward, because the X factors that have made us successful today, let's hope that we'll find ways to make those the things that make us successful tomorrow as well.
That's right. Well, and so since this session has been recorded, we'll all decide if we want to replay this in a year's time and see how effective your crystal balls were. Well, thank you all for your time today. I really do appreciate it. And man, I can always count on my AURP colleagues for maximum flexibility and still bringing a lot of brilliance. So I'm grateful for that today. So to all of our attendees, I want to thank you for joining this session. I hope you found it useful. And I also want to encourage you now, because we have some time before our next session, to check out the exhibit hall and all of the sponsors that are there. There's a lot of great videos to watch and a lot to learn about our different sponsors. We have a break at this time, but we're going to reconvene at 3:50 for our next speaker that you do not want to miss, Dr. Michelle Mcmurray Heath, who is CEO of the Biotechnology Industry Organization, or you might know it as BIO. Thanks again, and I'll look forward to seeing you guys soon.
Thank you, everyone.